بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على نبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is my first video on this channel, and I would just share some general knowledge that I have around different Islamic topics. So in UK, there is a diverse Muslim community, and from amongst them, there are three large Muslim groups from different movements. They are Salafis, Deobandis, and Barelwis. These groups have some things in common and some significant differences. These differences can lead to people, the general lay public, in becoming confused what true Islam is. So the purpose of this video is to give some information on these differences amongst the three groups. So these videos will be in three parts. Part 1 is neo-salafism, part 2 Barelwis, and part 3 Deobandis. And I will focus on how these differences impact other Muslims in UK and in Europe generally. For example, last week on an Islamic channel, a person called in and they asked a question. They said, I see my family and friends visiting the graves. Is this permissible? The scholar who answered, he immediately said, no, this is haram and this will lead to shirk. Now this person actually must have just got confused, thinking, why do I see people around me practicing different to what the Imam is saying? Who is right? The person most likely is unaware of their background. They might be from a Barelwi background, a Deobandi background, or any other background that allows visiting the grave. And the person they are seeking a fatwa from is a Salafi. The Salafis have certain aspects in their theology and their fiqh which differ from others. So the focus is to understand why there are these differences. I do not wish to delve too much into the background of Salafism, but the neo-Salafis now have been influenced by the Wahhabi movement, Ahl Hadith, and the ideological thinker Ibn Taymiyyah. So Salafis. The word Salafis is derived from as-Salaf as-Salih. This means the righteous predecessors. Who are these righteous predecessors? They are the generation of the Sahaba and the following two generations. So altogether there are three generations. And this is actually, this understanding of these three generations is derived from a hadith. Salafism is not restricted to a border. It has become a global movement, and it has been accepted globally. Salafism has been gaining a lot of popularity in Europe, mainly amongst the youth and the converts. So what is the reason that Salafism is growing in its popularity amongst the youth? One point that really stands out for the youth is the claim of Salafism to follow the pure religion, to adhere to Tawheed, and to shun all forms of shirk. But the question is, every single group claims to believe in the oneness of Allah, and every single group claims to reject all forms of shirk. So how are Salafis different from other groups? How is their claim different from other groups that they follow the pure religion of the as-Salaf as-Salih? It is important to understand there is a methodology there. The methodology of the Salafis is that any laws or practices that came into existence, that emerge after these three generations, are either a bid'ah, innovation, or they can lead to shirk, polytheism. So from amongst these practices is the practice of Sufism. Sufism was practiced after the first three generations. So for Salafis, since Sufism emerged as a practice after the first three generations, it is definitely not from the Sunnah. But it is more than that. For Salafis, Sufism can lead to shirk. And that means all rites and rituals associated with Sufism will also lead to shirk. For example, visiting the graves, visiting the holy shrines, celebrating Urs, celebrating Milad, Tawassul, seeking the means to God. And out of these three groups, the most Sufi orientated group are the Barelwis. So naturally, there is a conflict between the Salafis and the Barelwis. But from among Salafis, there are certain groups who don't just accuse the action to be an action of shirk, but they would accuse a person to be a mushrik. So when you call someone a mushrik, what you are in fact doing is excommunication, doing takfir of this person, saying they are not a Muslim. And obviously that would lead to a conflict. So these two groups have some significant differences because of the Sufism element. So for Salafis, Sunnah is strictly what was practiced within those three generations. If it is not approved, any worship, any action not approved by the text, then it is not a Sunnah. So for example, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after the Fard Jama'ah, he did not make a dua in Jama'ah. There is no text to approve that. I'm talking about the 5 Fard Salahs. So for Salafis, if anyone begins to, any masjid, the Imam, he begins to make a dua in Jama'ah after the 5 Fard Salah, if he does it once or twice, it's fine. But if he's doing on a regular basis, it becomes a bid'ah. As for some other sects, as long as it helps you to grow spiritually and it is a worship, they won't regard it as a bid'ah. So for Sufis, for the Salafis, it is very important that all forms of worship and all actions are from the Sunnah. Anything done which is beyond the Sunnah, there is no text to approve it, it becomes a bid'ah. Now, because Salafis, they claim to follow the pure religion and they claim to shun all sorts of innovations, this has led to a sense of supremacy where they believe they are on the guided path, on the right path, and every other group, every other sect has some sort of deviancy attached to them. And this sense of supremacy actually attracts the youth because the youth like to believe they are on the pure religion. They are not making mistakes in their religion. And the Salafis would also urge the students to only study from a Salafi scholar and not a scholar from any other sect, because according to them, scholars from other sects might teach deviancy in terms of doing certain actions. I would like to point out that every group claims to follow the pious predecessors, but in reality there is not a single group who can go back in time and live amongst the Sahaba and see how they practice their religion. It is not possible. So in reality, what every single group does, they do an interpretation according to the best of their capabilities to understand how did these Salaf as-Salih live their lives, how did they practice Islam. For Salafis to do this interpretation, they have a methodology in place as well, just like all other sects. So for Salafis, they believe if they literally translate the text, i.e. the Quran and the Sunnah, if they are doing a literal translation, a literal understanding of the text, then they are more closer to the opinions, to the understanding of the Salaf as-Salih, and there are less chances of deviation. So an example of that is, for example, in the Quran, Allah Ta'ala, He mentions His attributes. He mentions He has a hand, he has eyes, he has a face. So for Salafis, if Allah Ta'ala has mentioned in the Quran he has a hand, then he actually has a hand, but the details are unknown. Similarly, he has eyes, he has a face, but the details are unknown. As for some of the other groups, they would understand these ayat metaphorically. So the hand of Allah Ta'ala would stand for his power, his eyes would mean under his care, and his face would refer to his grace. So these two groups, they understand the text in different ways. One would understand it metaphorically, especially when it is concerned with the limbs of Allah Ta'ala, the hands and the eyes. And the Salafi group, they would take it literally. Another main difference between these groups is that Salafism rejects blind following of any madhab, whereas the Deobandis and Barelwis, they both follow the Hanafi school of law. So the four schools of law are the Malikis, Hanafis, Shafi'is and Hanbalis. And these schools have existed for many hundreds of years. But for Salafis to follow these schools is also a bid'ah, because taqleed did not exist in the times of the as-Salaf as-Salih. There was no school of law, and the Sahaba did not adhere to any school of law. So for the Salafis, that means this is a bid'ah, the neo-salafis. Instead, what the Salafis believe in is ijtihad. Ijtihad means to strive to understand the text and to derive the law from it. So for Salafis, it is a responsibility on every single individual that they should study the text, the Quran and the Sunnah. And that is actually one of the reasons most of the Salafis are actually well educated in the matters of deen. They have a good level of education in understanding the Quran and the Sunnah compared to the most of the laymen from other backgrounds. But the thing is, other groups, other schools of law also do ijtihad. So how is their ijtihad different from the ijtihad of the Salafis? The difference falls within the framework. Every school of law has an existing framework, which we call usulul fiqh. So the Hanafis have their own usul, i.e. principles. And these principles, this framework has already been set by the classical scholars. So the new scholars, when they are striving to find new laws, they work within that framework. As for Salafis, at the moment, the framework is not there. But they are heading towards creating a framework. So for example, wiping the face after making dua. According to Salafis, it is not permissible because there are weak ahadith for that. According to most of the schools of law, it is permissible because even though there are weak narrations, but there are quite a few of these weak narrations in number, and altogether they strengthen one another to a higher level. This higher level is known as Hasan li ghayrihi. What we learn from this mas'ala is that the Salafis have a principle, and their principle is that you should only accept authentic sahih hadith. And it is these principles, when you start putting all the principles together, you eventually create a framework. So Salafis are actually heading towards creating a framework, and you never know what this framework would eventually lead to. I would just like to give an example here. Just a few months ago, there is a masjid in London. This masjid, the musallis in this masjid, they are predominantly all Hanafis. And the new imam, the trustees appointed, he was a Salafi. There was a miscommunication between the trustees and the imam. Both didn't know that one is a Hanafi masjid predominantly, and the Imam is a Salafi. In Ramadan, when the Salafi Imam, he had to pray witr. He refused to lead Jama'ah in the witr prayer according to the Hanafi way. He refused to pray witr the way Hanafis pray. This eventually led to a conflict between the Imam and the Musallis. But what they did not realize is that a Salafi cannot be following your madhab. It's simply against their aqidah, because their aqidah relies on this belief that they have to strictly follow the first 3 generations and they cannot do taqleed. And following witr the way Hanafis pray, for a Salafi, that means they are following Imam Abu Hanifa and his school, that is taqleed. They can't do that. So masajid generally need to be careful when appointing an imam, and they have to take in consideration the majority of the musallis as well, so there are no conflicts. So far we have made a point that the Salafis, for them, pure religion means to follow the first 3 generations. Any law, any practices that came after that, that includes the 4 schools of law and Sufism, you cannot follow them. No taqleed in the 4 schools of law, because that is a bid'ah. As for Sufism, according to them, it leads to shirk. And to avoid any kind of misunderstanding, in their opinion, it is best to understand the text literally. So then we move on to another theological point. So the Salafis, they believe in something called al-wala wal-bara. Al-wala means to be loyal, and al-bara means disavow. So the loyalty is for the believers and the disavow is for the non-believers. This means you be friends and loyal to believers, and you do not be friends with the disbelievers. You do not follow their paths, and the loyalty is not for the disbelievers. Now, al-wala wal-bara is actually unclear how the different Salafi groups actually implement it. So, for example, there are political Salafis. For the political Salafis, sometimes they would use al-bara and do takfir of their leaders, because they would say their Muslim leaders are being loyal to the leaders of non-Muslim nations. They are being loyal to disbelievers. So if a believer becomes loyal to a disbeliever, then you can do disavow of the believer as well. So this is how sometimes the political Salafis would use it. As for jihadi Salafis, they would go one step further, and they would use al-bara and do excommunication of an entire Muslim state, and through this they would legitimize jihad against the Muslims, and they would kill many Muslims, and this is exactly what they've done. As for the majority of the Salafis, the general Salafis, in their everyday life, they understand al-bara as being different from the West. They would make every effort to dress different from the West. So not follow the Western attire, not follow the Western occasions like birthdays and Mother's Day, not follow Western greetings like saying hello or waving the hands, etc. And what this has led to is that Salafis have a very distinct appearance. They can be identified from far away. So you would see most of the Salafi men wearing thobe and pants above their ankles, long beards. Most of the Salafi women will be dressed in black, and this dress up has gained a global acceptance, because remember, Salafism is a global movement. And what this dress up does, it connects Salafis from around the world. A Salafi in UK who sees a Salafi dressed the same in a Middle Eastern country or an Asian country, they would connect immediately. They would have al-wala, loyalty to each other, because they are dressed in the same way, That means they share a same identity. And this sense of identity, of connecting with Muslims around the world and sharing same belief, is what has also contributed in attracting a lot of the youth in Europe. The youth in Europe, they do have an identity crisis, and it helps, this distinct appearance actually helps them in connecting with other Salafis around the world, and it gives them a stronger sense of identity. Also, sorry, I would also like to point out that the black dress up, the black abaya, sorry, it is actually not restricted to Salafis. Women from around the world, Muslim world, from all sorts of different sects adopt this attire, but perhaps not on a regular basis like the Salafi women do. Salafis, just keep in mind, they are very critical if a believer follows the lifestyle of the disbelievers, has loyalties towards them. This can actually lead to some Salafi groups doing takfir of this believer. Now, Salafis are not one group. There are many subgroups under Salafism. It is a spectrum ranging from fundamentalists to some flexible ones. So from the fundamentalists, this would include the jihadi Salafis like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they are a minority. Then somewhere in the middle you would have the political Salafis, and most of them are in Middle East. And in UK and in Europe, the majority of the Salafis we have are those who are active in giving da'wah. They can be referred to as the quietest or the purists, because they signify on the importance of purifying the religion, and that's what they work towards. So the majority of the Salafis in UK, and generally the majority of Salafis, are the purists who work on giving da'wah, in purifying the religion. Also, I would like to point out, if you have any further questions on Salafism, or generally are interested in any other topics and want me to talk about it, then do write down in the comment section, and inshallah I will look into it. So my next part 2 would be on, it's on Barelwis, and part 3 will be on Deobandis. And see you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.